In part 1 of this series, we learned about how the city of Colares and the surrounding area began to experience a wave of dangerous UFO encounters, beginning in 1977. In part 2, we learned of the Brazilian military's investigations into the region, which produced thousands of pages of documents and photographs detailing these UFO encounters. Despite the military having their own encounters, the official statement by the Brazilian government was that the UFO encounters had by people were merely optical illusions. In part 3, we will learn how, despite the government denial, there were many that continued to push for information about the UFO sightings in Colares. Before we continue into part 3, I'd first like to promote my Patreon. If you enjoy my research and work compiling UFO information into tangible videos to help educate people on the UFO phenomena, consider becoming a patron. Thanks for watching, and let's continue on to part 3. Some UFO researchers continued to investigate the events that occurred in Colares. Among them were American UFO researcher Bob Pratt, who traveled the region extensively, interviewing witnesses and writing about the events and publishing the findings in the International UFO magazine during the 1980s and 1990s. In the days before the internet, and when the UFO community was still forming, Bob Pratt's articles allowed a window into the Colares flap for those interested coming from the English-speaking world. Another UFO researcher who was continuing to follow this UFO flap was Jacques Vallée. Jacques Vallée would also travel to the region and interview many witnesses, including Dr. Carvalho. He would write many of his findings in his book, Confrontations, describing the witness accounts and recording the symptoms that Dr. Carvalho would describe. Vallée would note that many of the symptoms and effects were consistent with those seen in high-power microwave weapons. Vallée would say, "What UFO witnesses describe as light may in fact be a complex combination of ionizing and non-ionizing radiation. Many of the injuries described in Brazil, however, are consistent with the effects of high-powered pulsed microwaves." He later pointed out that pulsed microwaves may interfere with the central nervous system. Such a beam could cause the dizziness, headaches, paralysis, pricklings, and numbness reported to us by so many witnesses. Vallée would once again come to the conclusion that it makes no sense that the greater scientific community does not take the UFO phenomena seriously, writing, "The material gathered represents only a portion of the cases I have personally investigated, and a very small percentage of the data compiled by other researchers and by official agencies. The realization that none of this material has ever been seriously examined by professional scientists is staggering. Strictly in terms of the sociology of science, the refusal to consider the facts of the phenomena is a remarkable statement about the narrow limits within which our society authorizes the serious pursuit of knowledge." The real heroes in keeping the Colares cases in at least the UFO community zeitgeist were the Brazilian ufologists. Among them were Daniel Rabiso Geisse, who wrote the book Vampiros Extraterrestres na Amazônia, which covered extensively the Colares flap. Marco Petit, who in 1981 founded Fluminense Association of UFO Studies. And lastly, A.J. Guevara, who many consider to be the godfather of Brazilian ufology. A.J. Guevara had a UFO experience in 1982, which led him to a lifelong pursuit of truth about the UFO phenomena. In 1985, he launched the magazine Ufologia Nacional and Internacional, which ceased publication in 1986. In 1988, he started the UFO magazine, a publication which soon grew to the largest UFO periodical in Brazil and still runs to this day. In this magazine, he, along with others, would continue to pursue UFO and cow mutilation cases, not just in Brazil, but in the greater Latin American region. He founded and became the director of the Brazilian Center for Flying Saucer Research and the Brazilian director of MUFON. I personally liken A.J. Guevara to a Stanton Friedman of Latin American ufology, and his impact on ufology is immense. Eventually, A.J. Guevara would establish his reputation so well that in the mid-1990s he was anonymously delivered select excerpts of the Colares investigation report, completed by the Brazilian Air Force team. These documents reinvigorated public interest in the Colares flap, which by that time was roughly 20 years old. Then, in 1997, a major break would occur. A.J. Guevara and Marco Patan would interview Captain Holanda, the leader of the investigation team, who is now retired. Captain Holanda was the first person from the Brazilian government or military to speak out about the Colares flap in a way that did not conform with the official lighthouse narrative. Hollanda would confirm that his team was initially very skeptical of the UFO claims of the people of Colares, that his team would have their own encounters, that they were instructed to downplay the event, and that there was video and photo documentation of the UFOs. Captain Hollanda was personally not satisfied with the cover-up and kept a keen interest in UFOs after his own experiences. He had been following the career of A.J. Guevara, and once he had retired, he knew A.J. was someone he could trust with his testimony, the entirety of which is linked in the description. Unfortunately, shortly after Captain Hollanda would go public, he would die by suicide. This suicide is very controversial and divisive in the UFO community, with half suspecting that he was in fact silenced by the government or perhaps even the UFOs themselves, and the other half thinking it was a legitimate suicide. And once he had gotten what he had to say out into the world, he was ready to go. For what it's worth, A.J. Guevara believes that it was a legitimate suicide. The release of this explosive interview encouraged others who were in the investigation team to come forward and corroborate some of Hollanda's claims, like Petty Officer Moacir Neves de Almeida, Sergeant Flavio Costa, and Sergeant Alvaro Pinto Santos. But there were still holdouts for the official government narrative. In 2001, Brigadier General Portasio Lopez de Oliveira would repeat the official claim that a lighthouse caused the hysteria that gripped the region for months in the late 1970s. Interestingly enough, though, the Brigadier General's own daughter, Nahima Lopez de Oliveira Gonçalves, would refute these claims. When she was 60 years old, she would say, "My dad would come home with the film rolls and go straight to the library. One day, he let us watch them. You could see lights moving in all directions." The next major development in the Colares UFO flap would occur in 2004. A.J. Guevara would organize the movement UFOs, Freedom of Information Now. The goal of this political movement was to lobby the Brazilian government to release documents regarding the Colares flap, as well as other UFO events in Brazil's history. Everyday Brazilians were encouraged to contact their local officials and push for the disclosure of UFO documents, and eventually, 36,000 Brazilians signed petitions to the government to get the files opened. A.J. Guevara would say, "We want them to admit that they are studying or have studied the topic and accept that ufologists know their files. If there is an official research movement underway, ufologists should have the right to know how it works and the right to offer to participate." This wasn't the first time a movement like this would gain traction in Brazil, but now that A.J. Guevara had excerpts of the Colares report and members of the Colares investigative team had come forward, there was more leverage on the part of the ufologists advocating for the release of UFO information from the Brazilian government. Eventually, the group would achieve one of the most successful developments in ufology. On May 20th, 2005, A.J. Guevara and a delegation of ufologists met with Brazilian Air Force officials in Brasilia, headed by Brigadier General Teles Ribeiro, Chief of the Air Force's Center for Public Communications. The ufologist team was able to get the government to release hundreds of pages of documents relating to three major Brazilian UFO cases: the 1996 Virginia UFO incident, the 1986 Night of UFOs, and the 1977 Colares flap. The archives also showed that the Brazilian Air Force had a specific UFO studies department between 1969 and 1972. The system of investigation of unidentified aerial objects operated at the facilities of the 4th Comar in São Paulo, comprised of civilian researchers and military authorities. It is from this campaign that we are able to see the documentation and pictures presented in this video, and that we get confirmation from the Brazilian government that there was a legitimate investigation into UFOs in Colares, Brazil, that remained unexplained. In one of his final moves before passing away in 2005, Bob Pratt would translate the entirety of the released Colares report to English, furthering the reach of the story. According to A.J. Guevara, Brigadier General José Carlos Pereira was the main reason this soft disclosure was allowed to happen. Brigadier General José Carlos Pereira personally escorted the ufologists through the government buildings and files in 2005. Informally, Pereira confirmed to the ufologist his great interest and high level of information on the subject, and his desire for more people to learn about it. Brigadier General José Carlos Pereira had discussed UFOs publicly in 2002, and following the 2005 Freedom of Information Now campaign, he would say, "You don't break a culture at once, and I am not in favor of disclosing documents that hurt people's privacy, induce panic to the population, or put the country's security at risk." This development is extremely significant, not just for Brazilian ufology, but ufology as a whole, and Brigadier General José Carlos Pereira is a highly underrated person in the UFO community, in my opinion. But even with this major development, however, a majority of the Brazilian UFO documents still remain classified, and none of the Colares Super 8 films have been released. Now, before we close, there are two more points I want to briefly cover. The first being the involvement of Robert Bigelow and the NIDS team. Robert Bigelow is a billionaire real estate investor with a personal interest in ufology that has led to him funding multiple research groups into the topic. I recommend my video on Robert Bigelow to get more information on the man. One such investigative group that he founded, BASS, is confirmed to have sent a team down to Brazil in 2009. You can read more about this trip in some of the links below. As UFO researcher Keith Basterfield has done an excellent job piecing together some of the details of this trip. But the gist is, Bigelow sent his people down to Latin America to investigate many of the big UFO cases from the region, and it is widely believed that Bigelow is in possession of many more documents than were released by the Brazilian government. It is also believed that Bigelow is even in possession of some of the infamous Super 8 film recordings of the Colares UFOs captured by Captain Holanda's investigative team. Now, the last quick thing I want to cover is a 2002 Indian UFO case that is eerily similar to Colares. If there was more information available about this case, I would create its own video for it, but since there isn't that much information available, I figured I would include it here. Some of the headlines from the time are, Alien kills 7 in India. Has a UFO struck Indian villagers, or is it just bugs? Police skeptical, as 7 reported dead in UFO attacks. These accounts come from the rural Uttar Pradesh region of India. Here are some excerpts from the articles of the time. It comes in the night, a flying sphere emitting red and blue lights that attacks villagers in this poor region, extensively burning those victims it does not kill. At least, that's what panic-stricken villagers say. At least 7 people have died of unexplained injuries in the past week in Uttar Pradesh. A mysterious flying object attacked him in the night, Raj Pal said of his neighbor, Ramjpal, who died recently in Shwana. His stomach was ripped open. He died 2 days later. It was like a big soccer ball with sparkling lights, said Kalawati, who uses only one name. It burned my skin. Perhaps the most bizarre theory was that of Police Deputy Inspector General K.N.D. Devaldi, who said that the assailant was a genetically engineered insect introduced by an anti-national elements from outside India to cause mayhem. In common Indian parlance, this is taken to mean that it is the work of a Pakistani spy agency, the universal scapegoat of all unexplained Indian woes. That theory has not won over many believers. Villagers across the region no longer sleep outside, as they usually do during the sweltering summer heat and long power failures, fearing that they will be easy prey for the UFOs. In some villages, the entire population are squeezing into the headman's house for the night, seeking shelter and safety in numbers. Having lost faith in the police, villagers have formed nocturnal protection squads. Doctors dismiss these stories as mass hysteria. Some accuse local officials of inaction in failing to capture the aliens, and one person died on Thursday in nearby Sitapur when police fired shots to disperse a 10,000-strong crowd demanding that authorities capture the mysterious objects. This wave was relatively short-lasting, about 2 weeks, but it did turn the region into a frenzy, and has some eerie similarities to the Colares case. I wish there was more info about it, so it could get its own video, but there isn't, and I wanted to include it now to show the disturbing similarities to Colares. There is a lot to be said about the events surrounding the Colares UFO flap that gripped northern Brazil in 1977 and 1978. When one is first getting into the subject of UFOs, it can be quite exciting, learning about cases like the Nimitz UFO encounter, or some of the encounters where it seems UFOs are interested in disarming nuclear weapons. A common sentiment you will see online is that UFOs aren't a threat because if they were, humans wouldn't be here. However, the Colares flap is one of the best examples that some UFOs intentionally harm humans. The fact the military was sent out to investigate and was able to produce hundreds of documents, photos, and video evidence adds to the credibility of the story, which is exciting from a UFO point of view, but very disturbing when you think about the consequences. Colares shows us that governments of the world have been interested in studying this subject. One can see why governments cover up UFOs. Inspiration can be drawn from the work of A.J. Guevara and the organizing of everyday citizens into lobbying the Brazilian government to release some of these files, but the fact remains, what happened in Colares wasn't a positive experience from the point of view of the humans who lived there. Their lives were uprooted by the UFOs, and then by the government, who ignored the real trauma they had endured and turned them into objects of ridicule. I often wonder what would be the implications of a Colares-type event happening today in the age of smartphones. I personally think that it would set the world off into a global panic. Hopefully it never happens, but the overall point still remains: not all UFOs are our friends.